Marion, folks.
Mary, you snuck it in there. I love it.
Oh, man. You liked your afro?
Good job. Good job.
That was back in my seminary days. I had a big afro.
You were the black sheep, huh?
I was. I did not fit in.
See, now I feel like we all have something in common here. I felt like the black sheep my whole life.
It's fantastic.
What did you think, Audrey? What's on your mind?
What's that?
What's on your mind?
Wow. I was still stuck back at afros and black sheep, and I was thinking about how oftentimes the black sheep are world changers. So let's go.
Yes. So we were kind of having this conversation about like some of the concepts and teachings that are really unhelpful in regards to healing from abuse. So there's some posts out there publicly by Hope and Duick on Facebook. And let me just read you an excerpt from one of the abuse awareness meetings. It says they were held in February 2020 in Northeast Missouri. When the wife of a perpetrator learns how hard it is for her husband to overcome and supports him to overcome, even when he still fails, he can better overcome. God is the only person that can change anyone. Quoted by Harley Miller on a woman's view of being molested. What are your thoughts about that? Is that helpful or harmful? Or are you neutral?
Hit it, Audrey. I can tell you're
Come on,
you're raring to go.
Let it out. Is it helpful, harmful? Or...
I mean, it's exceedingly harmful because I mean, whenever you put that type of responsibility on a woman, you're basically making her responsible for the marriage. You're essentially saying that she's responsible for the marriage the same way Christ is the head of the church, and it's completely backwards. It's never a woman's responsibility to heal her husband, ever.
Does it give accountability for the perpetrator of the abuse?
Does what give accountability? Putting that on the shoulders of
the woman?
The wife?
Yes.
No, not at all. Yeah.
Okay.
Especially if she's being. Yeah, I mean, if she's being abused in that marriage, how in the world does that provide any kind of accountability for the abuser? You know, like what provides accountability is handcuffs.
Because what he did is a criminal,
right?
And that's where he belongs. So primarily, you know, I feel like some of the resources people need is like they need to know and understand that if nothing else, and you don't have access to call like a sheriff's department, you can always call 911 and just say, I don't know what other number to call. It's not an emergency right this second, et cetera, but this is what happened to me.
And the good thing too about 911 too is that it's recorded. It's you know, there's a transcript of it. So, you know, I think that's really important too. You may not feel like it's an emergency, but it well could be an emergency.
Yep. It really.
So, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and often if you're a victim in a situation like that, you are unable to even define what an emergency is.
Right.
Well, then that's because you don't know. I would say I was in crisis. I didn't know I was in crisis because I always lived in crisis.
They have been trained that it's normal.
Yeah, I mean, I'll give an example of this, and it's just the brainwashing and you know, using love as a weapon, which is what abusers do, right? They say, I'm doing this because I love you, or I'll stop doing this because I love you. Well, if you loved me, you wouldn't have hit me in the first place or raped me or whatever it was. But we had a neighbor who was being badly abused by her boyfriend who lived right across from my office, and this guy. I mean, he was violent. He's actually in prison right now for beating the living crap out of her. I had called the police on him multiple times, and they always came. They were always great, but their hands were tied because they're not the justice system. They're not a court. So they would come, they would make an arrest, but he would pull knives on her, he would threaten her, he would just out in the street very publicly. I was screaming at her, berating her. And she showed up on my doorstep at the church one day, and she said, he's cheating on me with all these women, but he said that he loves me, and I'm going to stay with him. And I'm like, let me stop you a second. He doesn't love you. I hear what he says about you. I hear how he treats you worse than people treat animals. He admits that he's cheating on you, and he demands that you stay with him. That's not what love is. So she was literally living in crisis, and she ended up almost losing her life, literally. And she didn't even know it.
Well, the thing about it is that when you live in fight or flight mode for so long, that is your normal. That is your baseline. Yeah. They have you trained to believe that it is normal to fear for your life on a regular basis because of the perpetrator or perpetrators. And they have you brainwashed to believe that it's okay to treat people that way. And they do this, and you don't understand. Go ahead.
And because most survivors were in some type of traumatic, had some type of traumatic childhood, they don't have a baseline for what's normal. And so they often go from traumatic childhood to traumatic relationships, from abuse to abuse, from the frying pan to the fire. And they can't even recognize it. I know that's what happened to me. I went from the frying pan to the fire and had no idea. I truly believed, this guy loved me and that he was, spiritual. Good. He stood up there and preached on Sunday and had devotions and taught Sunday school and, but we're, as a society, we're not taught to recognize emotional abuse. We all look around and we go, oh, he's pulling a knife on her. Oh, he's got a gun, or, oh, he's got he's choking her. We recognize the physical side of it, but very few people are actually trained in emotional and psychological abuse as a whole, as a society. Our media inundates us with it all the time. They use psychological manipulation every single day. We don't recognize it. And so then when there's victims who aren't bleeding or who aren't dying and calling 911 and going to visit the ER, we don't think it's that big a deal, especially when they're perpetrators standing in church. And so how can the public, how can they even reach out for help and reach out for resources if the public as a whole doesn't even realize the crisis that they're in?
That is an excellent question, which is why I've always said the child sex abuse problem is not just a plain community's problem. It's not just a religious problem. It's a American problem, because part of the problem is yes, there are people that romanticize the Amish and the plain people, and they're in positions of power where they do not do the appropriate things. But there are also those same people who will then, look at the media, look at Josh Duggar. Look at that case. They knew when he was 14.
Yeah.
And what did they do? They gave him a church work camp. Did they do anything, any qualified program that is run by the state that is supposed to provide rehabilitation for child sex offenders? Did they do any of that? No.
No, and the corruption, not to sound conspiratorial, because this is just fact, but the state police, the trooper who took Josh in, who interviewed Josh when he was 14, was later arrested for child pornography charges. And he's the one who held Josh's fate in the whole family's hands. So the family failed him. The state police failed him. The courts failed him. You had a judge who ordered that his records be expunged and be destroyed. So, from the very top, from the judge to the state trooper to the family to the Christian, quote unquote Christian therapy center, which was a joke. They weren't qualified to take a 14-year-old predator. They weren't qualified. They should have turned Josh Duggar away and said, this is way beyond our scope. I do it all the time, right? People come into my office and they ask for help in different areas. And I'm like, not my area. I'm not an expert in that area. And I will not take you. I will not sit with you. I will not pretend that I'm a counselor when I'm not, because it's not my area. And that's what that quote unquote Christian center should have done for Josh Duggar. Everybody failed the victims in that. Everybody.
And that's the sad part. So where was the social services worker? Where was the guardian ad litem? Where are these people that are supposed to protect the victims? Where are these people?
And not only did so many people fail them then, they're still failing them now. And I watched everything. I couldn't really address it publicly because I had so much other stuff going on in my own world. But when I watched it unfold the other week, and I watched people attack Anna for staying with him, and I just wanted to scream. I wanted to say, you failed from the very beginning, and society as a whole is now blaming her. Like, do you have any society doesn't seem to have a concept of how brainwashed and trapped these women are. Like, the blame doesn't belong there.
No, which goes right back to what Mary said at the very beginning, right? It's even society. Society does it. Church does it. They put the blame on the spouse and the responsibility, and said, "Well, Anna, Anna should have left him." I mean, she's a victim herself.
She is, so absolutely.
I do think Anna's a victim. I know that society is blaming her for it. But here's the thing, is somebody can have a porn addiction and not be a pedophile. Those are two distinctly different things. Can we clarify that? Like, for a fact,
how do they...
So people are condemning her because she knew he had a porn addiction, and that's why she had a porn tracker installed on his computer, and he went around and basically hacked the system and went around it and still had his pedophilic materials on the computer. And so people are condemning her for it, but it's like, here's the thing. It's like somebody having a porn addiction or somebody being a pedophile. That's like, one of them is a crime here for sure. One may be a sin, but the other one is a crime for a fact. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. So I don't feel it's right to even judge her for saying, like, you stayed with him when you knew he had a porn addiction. The porn addiction is not what caused the pedophilia. Thank you.
Yeah, exactly right. And I don't think, I mean, and again, in her defense, I don't think she knew that he was looking at child porn, because it's not like he went to her and was like, hey, I'm looking at these explicit, gruesome, as the investigator said, it was one of the top 5 worst of the worst that I've ever seen in my career. That was HSI, Homeland Security Investigative Unit. Do you want to know what kind of cases they have? I have a friend who's in the HSI, who's very high up in the HSI, and he just casually blurts stuff out, when I talk to him on the phone, and I'm like, at the end of it, I'm like, and this guy HSI said this was one of the top 5 worst of the worst images that I've ever seen in my career. That's what Josh Duggar was consuming. I don't think he went to his wife and was like, honey, I'm looking at, this is what I'm looking at. I'm going to put a blocker on my computer.
I'm gonna
this guy's sick.
I'm going to hack your firewall that you put on there to not allow me to watch porn, and I'm going to go do what I'm going to do. Yeah.
But let's back up a little bit here. Why in God's name was she his accountability partner? Because that's what these churches do all the time. They try to make me my husband's accountability partner. That's not right. Like, no woman should have to be their husband's accountability partner. If a woman has to be her husband's accountability partner, they should not be together. There is a much, much bigger problem.
Yeah. Yep.
Thank you. Thank you for pointing that out and talking about that, Audrey. That is something that is really needed to address, is the fact that, like, they do that to women. They make them be responsible for things. So here's the thing: it's like as a woman inside of an Amish community or a plain community, Audrey, you can probably attest to this. Like you're not really supposed to make decisions. Like when you're in public, you allow the man to walk first, and you have to follow after him, and that whole like you get the nod to get approval to do things. So you're not allowed to make any decisions, but you're the accountable person. Like, it's so confusing. I don't understand this. Where does this make any kind of logical argument for any type of assistance for child sexual assault or holding perpetrators accountable?
Well, I mean, and then let's talk about the whole fact of, well, then a woman just, obviously, if he has those problems, we're told routinely in that world that if he has those problems, then the woman's not doing her part. She's obviously not giving him enough of what he needs. I mean, I just listened to a story the other day where she was told, well, honey, I'm sorry if you just had a baby and you can't give him sex. You need to be giving him hand jobs. She's 6 days from having a baby. I mean, it's so mentally warped, but in that world, it's so normal.
Yeah.
Just because it's normal doesn't make it okay.
No, absolutely not.
Yeah, it's a really warped view. And Sheila Gregoire, we just had her on our podcast, and she wrote The Great Sex Rescue, and she talks about that, how this is so ingrained, this whole mentality that it's the wife's job, it's the woman's job to gratify her husband, because men are just these sex hyped up animals who can't help themselves, and if you don't gratify him, he's going to go get it elsewhere, kind of thing, and it's your fault as a wife because you didn't satisfy your husband, which is total bullcrap.
I have a question.
And they're visually stimulated, so the poor guys, they're visually stimulated. I mean, it's your fault if they look at you, because
I know.
Go back. You're the pastor.
I know.
You're the pastor here. Let's go back to the foundational teaching of the Garden of Eden. Okay, so they teach that a woman is created to be a helpmeet, which means in their world a slave for the man, and that she was the one who deceived Adam. So can you talk to us about that? And I think a lot of people have a subconscious misinterpretation of that scripture, of that story, of the baseline of humanity. So how can you speak to that today?
Yeah, I just read something the other day that I thought was really good, where it kind of broke that down and showed, like that view, that the woman was the one who, she's the deceiver. She's the one who pulled her husband into that. He was minding his own business, and then she came along. The little temptress brought him into it, and that was not the streamline, the mainline streamline view for centuries. That was not the quote unquote biblical or Christian view. That was introduced later in these extreme periods of patriarchal leadership, where men ruled the roost, and you had these Bible scholars who started warping their interpretation of that and saying, see, she's the one who seduced him. It was the woman who seduced the man. And that's not, if you go back and you forget everything that we know about these patriarchal systems, and I grew up, in a very patriarchal culture too, conservative churches always lean towards this patriarchal, men are at the forefront, women are kind of in the background, they know their place kind of thing. And it's just a sick, twisted, warped view of both men and women, who are equals in God's kingdom. They always are. And so, anyway, back to Genesis. I don't remember everything about this article because it was pretty lengthy, but he was basically saying, like, both the man and the woman had an equal role in being tempted and being enticed, and that it was Satan who was drawing them in. He knew how to draw them in. It wasn't that because she was deceived first, she's now the seductress. And so, you know, men beware, because women are little hussies who attempt you. Like, that's not the point of that story in Genesis. It's just not. It's such a warped view. It's so weird.
And when you start with that basic foundation of that being taught to children from the time they're born, and carry that into adulthood through church life, look at what it's producing. It's producing women who don't believe in who they really are, and it's men who think that they're entitled and they can do whatever they please. And we wonder why we have this crisis.
Yeah.
We're literally teaching women that they're for men. They're to be used. The only thing they're good for is sex and keeping men fed, because, you know, the weight of their hearts through their stomach. Pardon my sarcasm here, but you know, it's just, it's so twisted. I have a hard time even taking it serious anymore. It's a completely warped view, and we're raising them all the way through their formative years, and then we wonder why we are where we are.
Well, not only that, when you start talking about we're only good for keeping men fed, et cetera, like as soon as you start cooking as an Amish girl, like I was told, you're gonna have a really fat husband someday. And I'm just like, I was a small child. Like, I was literally a child. Like, I was a child. Who talks to their children that way?
Right.
Who does that?
Yeah, it's so messed up.
So I feel like they add to it. There's more than just like, there's the base foundation, and then there's little ways along the way that they literally program these children. So my question to you guys is how do we combat the programming? How do we get through the program and get to a healthier place for ourselves?
I mean, I'm really big on calling out this warped theology, and I talk about that in my book, right? Like, call out people who have this sick, twisted theology, and ask people the most basic question. Go back to the basics. Ask people the most basic foundation. If they're Christians and they're spewing this crap, ask them, all right, you're so smart about how men are the quote unquote head of the household. They're the spiritual leader of the household, which is totally nonsense too. You're so smart in all things Bible. What is God's foundation? Just let's start there, you know? And I will almost guarantee you 99% of the time, they're not going to be able to answer that most basic question. And it's righteousness and justice, you know? They will not be able to answer that question. And so my comeback is, if you can't even answer the most basic foundation of who God is, and you're building all this theology on some other foundation, go away, get lost. Like, I don't want to listen to you.
Well, you know, it's sad because we've created a society where we've reduced men to animals and women to slaves. And so we've stripped men of their manhood. We've stripped women of their femininity and their individuality. And we've created a culture that's powerless to dig themselves out of the own pit that they created. But there has to be a way forward.
Yeah.
Well, there has to be. And I think part of it starts by, deconstructing from that type of theology. And for me, I always find it important to make sure that I tell people, like, it doesn't matter if your mental health provider is a Christian or is not a Christian. What matters is that they have they are qualified. And when I say qualified, I don't mean go down to the church next door and ask the pastor for counseling. That may not necessarily be what you need. What you need to do is you need to go find people that are qualified trauma therapists that deal with PTSD, complex and chronic PTSD, because when you grow up that way, you're more than likely going to end up with complex and chronic PTSD. It's caused by repeated, consistent, traumatic events. And when you spend your formative years with that, what do you get? It's kind of like basic science here.
Yeah, I mean, you bring up a great point too, Mary, because there's this. It's not only the degrading of women and children within extremely conservative circles, but it's the degrading of all things secular. So, um, you know, the saying that I grew up hearing all the time, and I still hear it, and it drives me nuts. Is, well, we're going to seek out Christian people and Christian people only, because otherwise it's just man's opinion instead of God's word. And I'm like,
Well,
there are people who are fall out. I mean, radical atheists who are brilliant people, who are smarter than me, smarter than you, smarter than, a lot of people who have a lot to offer us. They have a lot of wisdom. They may know a lot about trauma. So don't talk to them as if they're these, bumbling idiots. Link hands with people who are non-Christians, right? Link arms with them and learn from them, grow. Because
Why
I feel like
the conservative. God, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to ask, why is conservative Christian culture so terrified of science and psychology?
I think
logic,
yeah,
facts cannot distort. It can't. When you live in the distorted reality, logic and facts attack your reality.
And I think too, it's emasculating for people who really truly believe that men are. I mean, they're the smart ones. They're the trained ones. They're the ones who have the authority to speak. They're the spiritual leaders of the house. They're the head of the house. They're the head of the church. All this stuff. When they truly believe that, educated, not just educated women, but educated people pose a really great risk to them. And it's a risk. And if abusers, the worst thing for an abuser, besides for being outed as an abuser, is to be made to look dumb in front of other people publicly, to be made to look dumb. They can't stand it. That's the one thing that will enrage an abuser quicker than anything else, is if they're made to look stupid in front of other people.
And then they usually take it out on their victims.
Yeah,
that's very common. Exactly right. They will escalate.
Yep.
The trajectory of escalation is real, people. If you find yourself in a relationship with somebody that the abuse increasingly gets worse, it goes from psychological abuse to physical abuse to threats about life to threats about kidnapping, etc., stalking. Please reach out to your local crisis intervention center. I think we were trying to make this a little bit shorter, and we're at about 28 minutes, so we probably got like 2 minutes left. Do y'all have parting thoughts on like what people should be doing if you see somebody being abused or you feel like they might be?
I mean, I'll just echo what you said at the beginning. Call a crisis intervention center, or if you don't have phone numbers handy, just call 911. I just said this the other day. I was a guest on a podcast, and most of the listeners are teenagers, and so I was asked, what would be your message be for teens who are being exploited in some way by an abuser? And my message to them was, even though somebody has authority over you, a school teacher, a pastor, whoever it is, even though somebody has authority over you because of their position and their age, you have far more power than they do by speaking up, because they don't want to be outed as an abuser. And when these creeps are sending you text messages and asking you for images and all this stuff, think twice before you get intimidated into sending them, and just make those texts public. Mm-hmm. You'll watch them scurry really quick, and you watch them panic. You have far more power over your abuser than you think you do. So start turning the tables on them if it's safe to do so. If it's physically safe to do so. And I know that that's a huge caveat, and it's safety is your number one concern, but You know,
Yes.
if somebody's non-violent and you know they're non-violent, start to out them.
Yep. And you know,
Well, and so, a
because
lot of
it's
times these abusers come across, they're bullies, and they come across with violent threats. That doesn't mean they're going to be violent. Most of them are cowards, and your voice is your most powerful asset. And whether you're the victim or whether you're an onlooker, if even as an onlooker, if you see something, use your voice. It's better that you use your voice and then it be innocuous than you use your voice, or that you fail to use your voice and then it turns out to be something far deeper than what you realize.
Yep. Thank you. Thank you very much, guys. I appreciate you coming. Have a good day.
Absolutely.